Good morning or afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Harkness. I'm the Senior Advisor on China for the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, and I'm really happy to have an opportunity to host today's webinar. I'm joined by Shefali Sharma and Emily Piney for the first of what will actually be a three-part series of IATP webinars exploring the industrialization and globalization of meat production in China. Shefali is head of the Agricultural Commodities and Globalization unit at IATP, and Professor Piney is at the International Political Economy Department at the University of Puget Sound. I think people will probably be joining us. I see we are, oh good, we already have a number of people online, and I'm sure some others will join us. I will give a short introduction of the theme and then introduce each of our speakers in turn, and they'll give their presentations. We'll try to get the presentations concluded by maybe 20 to the hour to make sure that we have plenty, or even half past the hour, to make sure that we have plenty of time for your questions. On your screen, you should have a capacity to type in messages, and you can use that to submit questions. I'll collect those questions during the presentations, and then after the presentations, we'll just move right into a Q&A mode. I think you also have the ability to send questions directly to the organizers, so that if you're having any problem with your attendance of the webinar, they can maybe help resolve some of those things too. So let's get started. Of course, because of its enormous population, China has always produced and consumed a lot of food, a tremendous amount of food. But until very recently, the impact on markets and on the environment outside of China were rather limited. Before the 1990s, the negative effects of land clearance, erosion, loss of biodiversity, and pollution associated with feeding China were experienced inside the country's borders because of China's food self-sufficiency policies. This was also because until that time, per capita consumption in China was much, much lower than it is today, and certainly much, much lower than industrialized countries. Over the last quarter century, all of that changed. First, China's eating a lot more now, especially a lot more meat. And of course, the environmental and land use implications of eating meat are much greater than they would be for simply consuming more grain. Meat was essentially just a sort of a condiment in China's almost entirely plant-based diet until the 1990s. Today, though, meat consumption is higher there than in many industrialized countries, not just in absolute terms, but on a per capita basis as well. And China is increasingly dependent on international markets for all that meat, or more to the point of today's webinar, for the feed that's used to raise all of that meat. The most dramatic global land use changes in the past 20 years has been the conversion of forest, grassland, and pasture in South America for soy production to export to China. We know that some of the big drivers behind this are China's rapid industrialization, double-digit GDP growth rates, changing diets, and large increases in disposable income over the past 25 years. But we also wanted to know more about how the process has actually worked, the role that global corporations and investors and government policies have played and continue to play in China's meat revolution, and to know where China's industrial meat juggernaut is going. We're concerned about impacts on farmers and rural communities and ecosystems and water quality and public health inside and outside of China, as well as the implications for climate change. And we feel that if we're going to address these challenges, we need to start by mapping China's meat revolution and its links to the global food system. And so, with support from the Grace Communications Foundation, IATP has been carrying out research over the past year, and we'll be releasing a series of reports that lay out our findings and will be the basis for continued work networking globally to try to introduce more sustainability into the globalized meat system. Today, we begin with an examination of animal feed, and especially soybeans. Our first speaker will be Shefali Sharma. She's the Director of Agricultural Commodities and Globalization at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. Shefali is leading IATP's initiative on the social and environmental impacts of an increasingly globalized and concentrated meat industry. Her work in the past year has focused on China's meat and feed industries, and the culmination of which will be 4 IATP reports that will be released within the next week. Over the past 18 years, Shefali's work has also focused on accountability of international trade and financial institutions, international trade and agricultural policies, and their implications for social justice. So I'm going to hand the baton over to Shefali Sharma now for her presentation. Shefali.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Jim. So before we go into the feed issue, I want to give you all a sneak preview of our 4 forthcoming reports on China and its meat and dairy industries. These will be launched next Tuesday, so I hope you will all stay tuned for the launch. China is the biggest pork producer and consumer in the world. Our report on pork uncovers how and why this has come to be and the role of dragon head firms, a status given by the government to public or private companies that are supposed to help with China's agricultural development. The report also discusses the impacts of this pork miracle. Our dairy report looks at the evolution of the dairy industry, from the millions of small producers that once existed to how the melamine scandal of 2008 changed the structure of the industry dramatically. It also looks at the government's role in creating that change and how foreign firms and Chinese firms are adapting to these new realities. The fact is that after the scandal, Chinese consumers now trust foreign brands more than Chinese ones for milk products. It explores how all of this is playing out in China today. Our poultry report shows how the poultry sector is one of the most vertically integrated meat sectors in China and how its growth is even outpacing pork production. It also talks about the role that food safety is playing in restructuring that sector. Even as we speak, another new strain of bird flu is creating illnesses and has resulted in 1 death in China, and the WHO is warning that this is a dangerous strain that has the possibility of resulting in a pandemic. The report touches upon the interplay of all of these issues. Finally, the feed report, which is the main focus of this webinar, looks at China's imports of feed and production at home. It also looks at the impacts of this production in China and abroad, particularly in Latin America. Our reports try and map out key developments in the pork, dairy, poultry, and feed sectors and flag some of the critical social and environmental impacts of this enormous growth and industrialization. They also look at the global linkages within these sectors. Our webinar series is intended to flesh out some of the key themes that we've uncovered in these reports. So thank you for joining us on this first one. The next one is Wednesday, February 19th. China is the world's largest producer and consumer of pork, the 2nd largest producer of poultry, and the 4th largest dairy producer. How and why has China achieved this meat miracle? What are the politics of this growth and the role of Chinese and foreign transnationals? Can China continue producing and consuming more, or are there social and ecological limits that create peak meat? And our third and final webinar will be on Tuesday, February 25th. China's meat revolution has entailed a massive increase in the concentrations of animals on specialized and industrial farms, with intense price competition amongst retailers and processors. This has resulted in providing a largely urban population with cheap and abundant meat. The food safety problems that are resulting from these developments is ironically driving the government to give more incentives for further scaling up and industrializing the supply chain. The U.S. meat industry is the model of efficiency that China is aspiring to. Can the Chinese public opinion, however, change this direction, and what lessons can be learned from the U.S. experience? So we hope you can join us in the next ones as well, and to register, please go to this link and sign up. And this link will be provided again later. So now to turn to China's need for feed and what we've learned about China's feed sector. Only 12% of the world's cereals are globally traded, of which a large proportion is feed. particularly corn, oilseeds, and soybean meal. Yet the demand for feed is on the rise with rising meat consumption. The FAO predicts that by 2050, the world will consume 200 million more tons of meat than we eat today. We can and should question the FAO's assumptions behind this figure, but even if we took it at face value, how is the planet going to produce the amount of cereals needed to provide this much feed for the global meat industry? And what are the social and environmental impacts of that production? This was one of the major questions that motivated our research on China's feed sector. Given China's continuous rise in the production and demand of meat, understanding how this plays out in China and in countries from which China imports feed, we can draw some important insights about what this will mean for land use change and the planetary limits to this type of production and consumption model. What China decides to import or produce from home has a big impact on the world market. This chart shows China's domestic consumption as a percentage of the world's total. You can see from this chart that China's consumption of soybeans, the green line, is a third of the world's total consumption, much of it going towards feed, though edible oil is second. And you can see that if China started relying on the world market for pork, which is the blue line, there wouldn't even be enough supply on the world market. Grain self-sufficiency has been an important pillar of China's food security policy, and one could argue its national security policy. China has long held a policy of 95% self-sufficiency in the production of rice, wheat, and corn. This means that 95% of corn, rice, or wheat should be produced at home. China used to be self-sufficient in soy, but it liberalized soy imports in the 90s as a strategic move towards ramping up meat production. By 1996, China had switched from being a net exporter of soy to becoming a net importer. Following WTO accession in 2001, Chinese imports increased by a whopping 253% between 2003 and 2012, going from 17 million tons to 60 million tons and moving towards 70 million tons this year. As you can see, the US and Brazil have been competing for the largest soy exports to China. Together, they make up over 80% of soy exports to the country, with Argentina a consistent 13 to 14% of the share. All of Argentina's whole soybeans go to China. And this demand for soy is expected to increase another 43% by 2017. This is because of increased oil and meat consumption, but also because meat producers are switching to more industrialized feed, which requires more soy. Government's push for standardization, scale, and consolidation to boost meat production is creating a greater need for feed. Soy has a unique history in China. It was never fed to animals traditionally, but was rather a big part of the diet. But with the development of the meat industry, soy became a key input. There are details in IATP's 2011 report and also in the new pork report. But basically, up to the early 2000s, the soy industry was in the hands of Chinese companies. But after WTO accession in 2001, imports increased, and in 2004, many Chinese crushers chose to default on their payments, as world soy prices fluctuated between the high contracted price and the much lower price at the time of purchase. Foreign traders took these crushers to arbitration, and the crushers were forced to make the payments, essentially bankrupting them. The crushing industry was taken over by the big four grain traders then, ADM, Bunge, Dreyfus, and Cargill, and they controlled nearly 80% of the Chinese market in 2007. Since 2007, however, the government has enacted laws and regulations that have scaled back that control. And in 2010, more Chinese players had a greater stake. In fact, the ADCVs, as ADM, Bunge, Cargill, and Dreyfus are called, were scaled back down to less than 40% share of the market. But the experience with the soy industry has been a tough lesson for the government. Declining yields of soy in the country, the feed sector entirely dependent on exports, has made the government, particularly the Ministry of Agriculture, weary about the same thing happening to corn. And the ministry wants to do everything in its power to not have the same thing happen. But as you can see, China's feed production has been steadily rising, and Chinese feed companies are emerging as major global players. An industry site has produced a listing of the top 100 feed companies, and 29 Chinese companies are included within the top 100, 8 are in the top 20, and China's New Hope Group is the third on the list, just behind Cargill. And it's the New Hope Group that's positioning itself to be the major trader in corn in China. Internally, China's feed sector is also rapidly consolidating. The government's current 5-year plan stipulates that by 2015, 50 feed companies should be producing 50% of the total feed output in China. We had 16 companies already producing 33% of the whole feed output in 2010. So, will corn go the way of soy? China has heavily invested into boosting corn production at home. In 2011, Morgan Stanley predicted that 70% of China's corn production went towards feed, 20% for industrial use, and only about 5% for food. China increased its production by 55% in just 7 years, according to its Ministry of Agriculture. And there are indications that China will be commercializing its own BT corn in the next 4 to 5 years, though GM crops still remain highly controversial in China. Yet in spite of this massive industrialization of corn, and though still quite small relative to China's production, corn imports have spiked in the last 5 years, even with record production. And the large majority of these imports have come from the United States. The U.S. Grains Council predicts that China will need to import anywhere between 19 to 32 million tons of corn by 2022. And just to put this in perspective, 32 million tons is a third of the entire global trade in corn today. Because of the import dependency with soy, China is also quite concerned not to be overly reliant on any one particular country for imports. So in recent years, China has been trying to diversify its sources of imports for various grains. And in addition to diversifying imports from countries, after its lessons from the TNC takeover of the soy crushing industry, China also decided that it needed greater control not just over its imports, but over its feed supply chain abroad. By the end of 2007, the government issued a directive for Chinese companies to go out and invest in the supply chain. Emily Piney will talk about what China's soy import boom has meant in Brazil and how China has tried to implement this go out directive on the ground in Brazil. But this slide shows just how many countries China is going out to, especially for soy and corn investments. As you can see, it's a diverse set of countries covering Africa, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and even the Philippines. So, some final feed for thought. Only 12% of China's land is arable. Water, land, and labor shortages are making grain production expensive in China relative to the global market. Of course, exporters are happy to provide China with grains. But what will be the impact of that on world market prices for grains? And what will that mean for import-dependent countries? And what are the social and environmental impacts of converting land to feed in other countries? We know what some of these impacts are in countries like Argentina and Brazil, and our report goes into many of these issues. In China, the impacts of ag intensification have been the following. High yields are leading to soil salinity and even more water scarcity. From 2000 to 2006, water tables dropped by 61% in the north and northeast. In the past decade, agriculture has shifted to cheaper, more fragile grasslands in the north and northeast, compounding environmental degradation. So this is a question for China as well. What are the trade-offs for producing feed versus food on this land to sustain the levels of meat consumption with this industrial model? It is reaching excessive levels in urban areas today. And what will this mean for food self-sufficiency for China in the future? And this concludes my presentation for today. And here's the link again if you'd like to get our reports and for the future webinars. Thank you.
Thank you, Shefali. Rather than go into, I see we already have some questions coming in, but I think what I'd like to do is move on to our second presentation and complete both first, and then we'll have plenty of time for some conversation afterward. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Professor Emily Piney, who is an assistant professor in the International Political Economy Department at the University of Puget Sound. Her research focuses on the role of multinational agribusinesses in the global food regime. Emily has examined China's going out policy for feed grains such as soy and what this means for control of the supply chain in Brazil. Her recent publications include Trading on Pork and Beans, Agribusiness and the Construction of the Brazil-China Soy-Pork Commodity Complex, in the edited volume, The Ethics and Economies of Agri-Food Competition, edited by Harvey S. James. And
She's a Cornell alum like myself, so it's great to have you on the webinar, and we look forward to your remarks. Thank you. Take it away, Emily.
All right, thank you, Jim, for that lovely introduction. Hi to all of you out there in webinar land. I would first like to say thanks to IATP for inviting me to talk about these really important issues. So as Shefali explained, imported soy has become a really crucial link in China's food chain. And it is the major exception to a really strong food self-sufficiency regime there. Because of this, China's soybean production has decreased over the last decade despite dramatically increasing demand. Shefali has already talked about the rapidly increasing demand for pork in China, and because of the strategic importance of soy as a main component of pig feed, China must look outside of its borders for soy. But dependence on other countries for such a strategic commodity violates the overall commitment to self-sufficiency. So a 2008 policy directive released by the Chinese government made specific recommendations for development of the soy market, both in China and in major exporting countries. The goal of this directive was to marginally increase domestic production, but perhaps more importantly, to try and gain more control down the supply chain outside of China all the way down to the level of the farm. So this is just a sort of a snapshot of the directive, and this final point, encouraging companies to go out and develop international resources, became the focus of my most recent research in Brazil. So Brazil became a major target of this going out policy for two main reasons. First, because it's one of the last places in the world with significant amounts of what is considered to be unexploited farmland, coupled with a very sophisticated and technologically advanced agricultural sector. Second, despite its sophistication, this agricultural sector still depends on foreign capital for survival. So first I want to just talk a little bit about the structure of the global soybean industry and the relative positions of Brazil and China in that structure. So here you can see this map, and I just want to sort of highlight the movement of soy, the development of the soy industry from the south of the country. So you can see here in the upper right-hand corner of your screen the 1990 map of soybean production in Brazil. And until the 1980s, soybeans were mainly cultivated in the south, and they mainly supplied the domestic chicken, pork, and edible oil markets. And through the 80s and 90s, the Central West region, which is this region here, became the target of rapid agricultural development. And in the mid-1990s, with the help of some changes to the Brazilian tax code that benefited exports of unprocessed bulk commodities, soybean exports really started taking off. And this coincided with rapid expansion in the Chinese soy crushing sector, which I'll get into in a minute. So this development was undoubtedly facilitated by homegrown Brazilian seed and soil technologies, but it is also clear that the Central West, again, this region here, wouldn't be the ag powerhouse that it is today without large-scale investment of foreign capital into infrastructure, storage, and transportation that happened throughout the 80s and 90s. The impact of large-scale agricultural expansion into this region is undeniable. The region saw massive land conversion from pasture and savanna to soy, and indigenous territories were circumscribed as the government gave large tracts of land to farmers who were willing to emigrate out of the south to colonize the interior. While the direct link to more recent deforestation is difficult to establish, the first decade of the 21st century was a really bad one for the Cerrado. And the Cerrado is the Brazilian word for the savanna that dominates this part of the country. And this was mostly due largely to rapid soybean expansion. More recently, again, the link is a bit more indirect as soy cultivation in this area tends to push cattle ranchers farther and farther into the forest. So as a result, the soybean frontier is shifting to this new area of soybean cultivation you can see in the blue box, and they call this the Mapitoba region because it encompasses parts of the states of Maranhão, Piauí, Tocantins, and Bahia. And this could have really important implications both for further deforestation and for water resources, because while soybean production in the Cerrado is mostly rain-fed, soybean production and all agricultural production in this area is much more heavily dependent on irrigation because this is a much more arid climate. So While there are many factors that brought soy to the Central West, the push into these new areas is undoubtedly fueled by increasing Chinese demand, and not just for soybeans. I want to talk just super briefly about corn because Shefali mentioned it in her presentation. And Brazil is quickly becoming a major corn producer as well, at the same time that China is increasing its corn imports. Last November, China actually signed a protocol with Brazil to start allowing corn exports. And in 2013, the first corn exports ever went from Brazil to China. So here's just a graphic showing the crop rotation in Brazil, which is very different than what the crop rotation looks like in the United States. They can plant corn. You can see these are combines harvesting soybeans, and these are grain drills planting corn directly behind them. And so planting corn right behind a soybean crop means greater intensification of land use. But it also means probably a greater demand for water because corn is a much more heavy feeder of water than soybeans are. So as crop production expands into the new region that I just showed you here, it's going to be really important to watch this trend as Brazil starts to produce more corn. But for now, soybeans, oh, there's one more map I just wanted to show you. Here's a similar map to the soybean map, and you can see 1990 here. This is corn production. And then in 2009, you can see corn is really starting to spread into these new areas as well. So this is definitely important to keep an eye on. But for right now, soy is still the star of the show. And while driving forces behind the intensification and extensification of soy production are quite numerous, it's clear that Chinese pork consumption and Brazilian soy production are mutually constituting trends. So on the surface of it, this seems like an ideal market constructed by David Ricardo himself, the father of the concept of comparative advantage. Soy production is more efficient in Brazil than in China, so China allocates its farmland for other crops. Brazil produces lots of soy. The two countries trade and efficiency is maximized. However, this kind of analysis ignores the environmental inefficiencies and social injustices that these politically constructed markets create, and it also misses the myriad ways in which the interests of the two countries are often not actually in alignment. So Brazil's position as the world's largest exporter of whole soybeans did not happen by accident, and I can talk about that, how that happened more in the Q&A if anyone's interested, and nor did China's position of largest soybean importer. We know that these were both the results of very particular government policies. But suffice to say, it is clear that the global soybean complex has been structured so that Brazil produces and exports whole soybeans that are then processed in China and other places too, but mostly in China actually. And in terms of political rhetoric, this of course is not Brazil's preferred position. Government officials insist that they would prefer to capture more of the value and create more jobs by processing soybeans in Brazil and then exporting soybean meal and soybean oil like Argentina does. And so to this end, Brazil is really hoping that Chinese investment will bring industrial and infrastructure development, jobs, and economic growth. So now I want to talk just a little bit about the kinds of investments that are happening in Brazil. So China's initial strategy in Brazil was to buy land for soybean plantations. And probably a lot of you are familiar with the land grab phenomenon that is taking place around the world. But the Brazilian federal government in 2010 responded to this by reinforcing an existing constitutional provision that limits foreign ownership of farmland. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A too if anybody's interested. But that constitutional provision essentially basically almost removed that option from the table. And so once that option was severely constricted, Chinese agribusinesses began pursuing other tactics. And so those other tactics include investing in infrastructure, direct purchasing from farmers, and building soybean crushing plants in Brazil. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these in turn. So different strategies make different sense in different parts of the country because of the unique geography of Brazil. And so the first example I want to talk about is the development of infrastructure in Mato Grosso. So again, this is sort of the traditional soybean frontier, but the capital of the state of Mato Grosso is actually the geodesic center of the South American continent, which means you physically cannot get any farther away from the coast than you are in Mato Grosso, which, as you can imagine, makes getting soybeans out of this part of Brazil really difficult. So everybody knows, everybody in Brazil and many people outside of Brazil know that the only thing keeping Brazil from expanding agricultural production to the maximum potential is their dismal infrastructure. Problems with logistics plague Brazilian agriculture and may be the only thing protecting the last remaining Cerrado from agricultural development. Clearly, the Brazilian farming sector would love to see China bring some investment in transport logistics, but in the words of one quite philosophical Brazilian government official who I interviewed, he said, quote, "Why would they want to spend money to build railroads that everyone will profit from? They just want soybeans." But in my estimation, this future of infrastructure in this region is the single biggest threat to the remaining intact forests that are legally available for development in Brazil. So watching that infrastructure development is going to be a really important thing to keep our eye on. So the next example and the next strategy that Chinese businesses are pursuing is direct purchasing from farmers. And this is tending to happen more in this part of the frontier. In the area of Goiás, farms tend to be quite a bit smaller than they are up here in Mato Grosso. And there's a much stronger tradition of cooperativism. So there's a much stronger tradition here of farmers working together to pool their resources to purchase inputs in bulk and to sell their product in bulk as well. And so this makes this region much more attractive for direct contracting with farmers. Although farmers that I spoke with here in Goiás like the idea of more competition in the market, they're actually quite dubious about signing contracts with Chinese buyers, in part because of past incidents where Chinese parties have broken contracts. And Shefali even mentioned one example of that back in 2004. So in turn, Chinese buyers, interestingly, are also uncomfortable with the barter system that farmers use in Brazil to finance production. So oftentimes, farmers who are selling soybeans to these transnational companies, the ABCDs, ADM, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus, they trade inputs like seed and fertilizer for a certain number of sacks of soy to be delivered at harvest. And this is the way that a lot of farmers in Brazil finance production. But Chinese companies don't, at this point, have any storage capacity or transport capacity in the towns where these farmers are producing. And they don't trust that Brazilian farmers will be able to deliver. And this is sort of an indirect effect of the bad infrastructure. And it was interesting in my interviews to hear about how both Brazilians and Chinese admitted that there is a significant lack of trust and confidence in the negotiations over direct purchasing. So those projects are still in negotiation. So the last example I want to talk about real quick is there's a Chongqing Grain, which is a Chinese agribusiness company, is building the largest crushing plant in Latin America in Barreiras, Bahia. And as far as I know, this is the only project that actually has physical boots on the ground, and it really could be a game changer for this new frontier. As Shefali mentioned, there's already tons of idle crushing capacity in China, so many Brazilians speculate that this crushing plant is as much a trust-building effort as an actual economic endeavor. And it's an attempt to gain a presence in the community so that Chongqing Grains can start developing relationships with farmers. And it's actually being built by a company called Universo Verde, which is a partnership between Chongqing Grains and some Brazilian investors. So as we have already mentioned, these transnational corporations have been in Brazil for a really, really long time. They completely control both the storage infrastructure and a lot of the transport infrastructure that is used to store soybeans, to dry them, and then to get them to export. And because they've been in the country for such a long time, a lot of farmers have long-standing relationships with their local Cargill or ADM broker. They trust these individuals, but they still feel completely beholden to these firms that wield oligopolistic control over almost all soybean markets in the world. And if there's a problem at the Brazilian port, as we know, Cargill can just send a shipment of soybeans from the US instead of sending them from Brazil. But Brazilian farmers don't have that option. They don't have any other alternative. And so they are really interested in the increased competition that could be presented by this Chinese investment, because at this point, A, B, C, and D are the only game in town. However, there are these obstacles for that investment. So what does all of this mean for Brazil? As I just mentioned, Brazilian farmers feel very beholden to, and Chinese consumers as well, feel beholden to these transnational companies. And while both Brazilian farmers and Chinese soy companies would like to find a way around the bottleneck of transnational control, there are a lot of reasons why that's difficult. There's really nothing to indicate that the Chinese demand for soy is going to abate anytime soon, and it's difficult to estimate the environmental and social consequences of increasing demand for soy. We still don't really know whether China is going to be able to compete in this oligopolistic market, and if they are, there are still some really, really big questions that we are left with. First of all, what is this going to mean for farmers on the ground in Brazil? What is it going to mean for the future of the remaining intact Cerrado and Amazon rainforests? And finally, what is it going to mean for Brazilian food sovereignty? And these are questions that the whole process, we're still too early in the process to really be able to answer these questions, but this is the direction that my future research is going to take. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will hand it back over to Jim.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Piney. We have a good 25 minutes now for questions and discussion, and questions have been coming in during the presentations. I would encourage anyone else who has questions, or if any of the answers to the questions for more questions, feel free to type them in so that we can try to deal with them all before the top of the hour when we'll need to sign off. First, a Brazil question for Professor Piney, a very specific one. What role, if any, does Brazilian investment in the Beira corridor in Mozambique play in Brazil's soy future?
Well, that's actually a really good question, and I think that brings up some really interesting questions about Brazilian transnational partnerships, and I think that we can sort of see the impact of Brazilian partnerships with Chinese corporations in Brazil and Brazilian partnerships with, for example, Japanese companies in countries in Africa, particularly Mozambique. So as far as what does that mean for Brazilian soy, I think it, you know, a lot of the soybean production in Brazil is, again, like I mentioned, you know, is really based on sort of homegrown Brazilian technology, and the Brazilian agricultural sector is incredibly sophisticated. So it's interesting to see, you know, the Brazilian Embrapa, the Brazilian sort of ag extension service, and other Brazilian investors taking that technology to Africa. I think that's going to be a really important trend to watch, and I think it's just going to increase soybean supplies. And the thing that's concerning about it, I think, is that they're really exporting the Brazilian agricultural model to Africa, and you know, that's not necessarily in and of itself a dangerous model, but it does use, it's very heavily dependent on fungicides and chemical fertilizers and that kind of stuff that could have some serious environmental consequences, and it's also a monocrop, you know, monocultural model. So it's definitely will be important to keep our eye on that.
All right, thank you. Next question. The floating dead pigs in Shanghai last year caused massive press coverage and public anxiety. However, the reason for that is still debatable. The Chinese government keeps arguing that industrialization is the only way out to solve food safety as well as food security issues in meat production, while alternative food activism argues it is exactly the industrialized, intensive production model that caused the problem. How do you interpret the debate, and where will the debate lead the meat industry in China in the near future? Shefali, do you want to take a crack at that?
Sure, this is a very good question, and it's a question that kept coming up in each of the reports that we did in dairy and poultry and in pork. I'm tempted to say this is going to be the big theme of our webinar, our last webinar on February 25th, so maybe we should answer that question on February 25th. But in the meantime, I think it is a huge challenge, and I think you're right, absolutely right, that the government is moving towards more industrialization, more standardization, more scale, more industrialization, which also means more concentration. And one of the themes and one of the issues that we felt after mapping the whole sector from processors, retailers, down to the farmers, was that right now farmers are being blamed, producers are being blamed for this. You know, producers are being seen as greedy, but the whole value chain is not being looked at. So at the end of it, what is really problematic is the price competition, and the fact is that the meat is very cheap, and you've got hundreds of farms that are competing for very cheap meat, and so that pressure as it goes upstream is what's creating a lot of these food safety issues. And so I think that these issues really do demand a much bigger debate in China. I know that consumers are quite concerned about this. This is the one area where consumers react very strongly and immediately whenever there's a food scare. And I think that there's a lot of potential to really examine what this model is about. And so we will be looking at these themes actually in our last webinar, and also talk to Tony Corbo from Food and Water Watch, who has spent a lot of time looking at the US, because you know the Chinese, as I said in my presentation, really look to the US meat industry as the model. But there are enormous food safety concerns with this model. And so I think it's actually opening up that debate that that there's a real opportunity to engage on these issues. I don't know, Jim, if you want to add stuff.
Yeah, well, one interesting note is that within China, when we were speaking to agriculture and food and pork industry experts last summer, they were talking about the misinterpretation of the fleet of floating dead pigs in Shanghai. That in the West this was portrayed, and even by some in China, as a horrible scandal that showed that food safety in China was in crisis and getting worse. Whereas in fact, what we were hearing is that at an earlier period, just a few years ago, these are essentially sort of downer pigs. If pigs died during the production process, their meat would simply go into an alternative channel and be sold, be ground up and sold to distant markets without people realizing that it was coming from dead animals that had died of disease or for whatever reason, and that the fact that these pig producers had decided that they had to simply dump the pigs into the river was in fact a sign that food safety standards were increasing in China. So there was no longer this alternate market. Of course, the action that they took in response to that lack of an alternate market was disgusting. But I think it speaks to the fact that China is in this betwixt and between situation of on the one hand, rapid upscaling and very long, complex supply chains in which consumers have very little way of knowing where their food comes from. And on the other hand, a lot of the production is still happening on a small scale. It's also happening in large facilities that are very poorly regulated. And so to many, the path of everything getting much bigger and being very closely regulated seems like it's the only optimal path. I think the question that some of us and some people in China are asking is, what is the scope for an alternative path that involves shorter supply chains, greater local accountability, and systems that can allow a variety of different production systems while maintaining and raising food safety standards? And this is really the question that we see China grappling with as more and more consumers are interested in and willing to pay more for food that they feel has been produced in a more responsible manner and that is safe to eat. We have a question again about Brazil for Emily. How has Brazilian government policy toward soy and soy exports changed in the transition from Lula to Dilma?
Well, it has actually been relatively consistent. There have been some new policies that have affected the industry indirectly. For example, Dilma recently privatized a lot of Brazilian port facilities, which you know, if you follow Brazilian agriculture and trade at all, you know that that is a huge problem for Brazil. Last year, if you remember, she probably had a slide showing that the Brazilian share of soybean exports to China actually dropped pretty precipitously last year, and that was partly due to the fact that there were massive delays at the biggest ports through which agricultural products leave the country. And so that is a huge priority for the government, and that has been something that the new administration has really focused on, trying to privatize those ports to make them more efficient, and that could have really pretty dramatic impacts for you know, either increasing concentration and control over those ports by agribusiness, or you know, we sort of remains to be seen. But otherwise, there have been some other sort of tax policies that have changed the game a little bit, but really the main political intervention was this one particular tax law that was passed in 1996 that basically repealed a particular kind of excise tax on exports of whole unprocessed commodities. And so if you, well, I don't have to go back to this slide, but there was a slide where I showed kind of the dramatic uptick in soybean exports that happened as a result of that policy. There has been some increasing and more stringent control over deforestation. It's been really controversial. The Rousseff regime, the forest code in Brazil has been a very, very hotly debated policy, and a lot of critics say that they're not enforcing a strong enough anti-deforestation policy, but it is arguably stronger now than it was under Lula. So those are just some of the policies that have changed, but remarkably consistent, I would say.
We have a question about dried distillers grains that I think I'll toss over to Shefali. With increase in bioethanol production, there will be increased availability of distillers grains, which is currently much cheaper than soybean or corn. How does increased availability of distillers grains impact use of corn and soybean in the future? Over the years, China is importing an increasing amount of distillers grains from the U.S.
That's a good question. We did find that in our research that the dried distiller grain imports are really shooting up in China now. But we also find that all the other imports are increasing as well, right? I mean, you can see that the corn imports are increasing in the last 5 years. Soy imports continue to rise. And I think it's a question of the ambition of the production. China is planning on having farms with 1 million cows, you know, in the coming year. There are going to be companies that will be having this much production on a single farm, and I think so. It's a question of scale. The slide that I showed about the share of China's consumption on the world market, I think, is a really important slide. And so even if you have a large number of dried distiller grains being imported, my feeling is that unless the production actually goes down and the ambition of the production goes down, I don't see that it's going to change necessarily the other imports. In fact, you can see that barley is going up, sorghum's going up, so there are other grains that are being used that are being replaced as a result.
I would just also maybe add really quickly that that the soybeans that come from Brazil, excuse me, are very, very high protein, and dried distillers grains are sort of a mid-protein feed content. And so, I mean, the soybeans that are coming from Brazil are even higher protein than the soybeans that come from the U.S. And so I don't think that there would necessarily, and I don't know, Shefali, if you have more information about this, but I don't necessarily think that there could really be a replacement of soy meal in animal feed just because of the high protein content of soy meal.
Yeah, I think that's another issue in terms of the digestion, and
right.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Yes, and to both of you, Shefali and Emily, either of you ever want to chime in on another person's question, certainly let me know. We have a question, I think, for both of you. Can the environmental impact be halted by the uptake of certified soy?
That is a really good question. That is a whole can of worms unto itself. So the person who asked this question may be aware of the soy moratorium that was adopted in Brazil. It was basically a voluntary agreement on the part of agribusiness to do their best to not buy soy that was planted or grown on land that was deforested after 2006. The success of the soy moratorium is dubious, I think. I believe that the jury is out. There are lots of people who are trying to determine whether or not it has actually had a role, or the degree to which it had a role in decreasing deforestation in the late 2000s. But the problem with certifying soy in Brazil is that it is really, really difficult to enforce any kind of certification. The use of remote sensing technology is actually, I think, maybe has the potential to make this a lot easier, and it's really interesting to see scientists who are starting to use satellite images to determine whether or not soy is being planted on newly deforested land. And so that is a sort of technological innovation that could be really useful in sort of helping us understand the degree to which soy is contributing to deforestation. But at this point, Brazil has a really difficult time enforcing its environmental policies because it's just the country is so vast, and the places where soy is encroaching on the forest are so remote that it's really hard to police that. And there's also a lot of hostility in the countryside to people who are trying to sort of regulate deforestation and regulate the sustainable soy or certified soy mark. So I think that I think that it has potential, particularly, as I said, with the increasing use of remote sensing technology and satellite images. But at this point, I think that it is of dubious utility at best. That would be my answer. I don't know, Shefali, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think Emily touched on this a little bit in her presentation about the indirect land use change that's happening since the soy moratorium, and I think that that's a real challenge, because when the soy moratorium was enforced, all the pasture moved up into the Amazon, right? And it's like now that there's been campaigns to have a beef moratorium in Brazil, and I think we really have to question the scale and the model here, rather than just looking at whether you can create a more sustainable supply chain. Because, I mean, there's even a discussion about, why don't we just intensify soy production? And that's just leading to a tremendous amount of pesticide use, of fertilizer use, and all kinds of other environmental problems. So I think those are interesting issues to think about, but the way that it seems to be playing out, we start to see environmental problems being displaced to other other commodities. And so there's fundamentally a question there about what we're consuming and how we're consuming. And the shorter supply chains that Jim's talking about are equally relevant to the shorter supply chains in Brazil, I think, and to thinking about what the social and environmental impacts have been with indigenous communities and et cetera. So I think it's a big challenge.
All right, next question. We have a question on animal welfare. Does any of your work address animal welfare in the intensifying meat and dairy industries in China? And again, I would expand this. It says to both speakers. So if either of you have a comment on that, either in China or Brazil, please feel free to chime in.
I think our reports look at the scale at which this kind of production is increasing, which obviously has clear animal welfare implications. But we don't specifically go into what is actually happening to the animals today, although it's very evident based on the stresses and the food safety issues that emerge, especially around issues like bird flu and things like that, and mastitis and all kinds of issues with cows, that this is clearly, the food safety issue is clearly linked to the animal welfare issue. And we will have Peter Lee, who is an associate professor at the University of Houston, who actually had a chance to visit many of these farms in 2006. And specifically, he's an advisor for Humane Society who really will address this link between animal welfare and food safety. And the challenge, I think, in China is that animal welfare is not the main concern that will shift people's opinions about the type of meat that they should eat, or the production model. It seems to be food safety rather than animal welfare, which is not to say that animal welfare should not be a critical concern, but I think that those linkages are not being made yet. And so this is also an area where I think that there is more scope and more thinking that needs to be done in terms of the framing and in terms of how do we make those connections. Jim, I'm sure you can also add your perspective to this.
Yeah, what I would add is, I mean, I certainly agree with what you said, and we will be able to hear more about animal welfare issues on that future webinar. I think that this is an example of the fact that there are different issues that can motivate action in different parts of the global food system. And in China right now, animal welfare is not near the top of that list. Public health and food safety concerns are higher, as well as perhaps issues around food sovereignty and national sovereignty. I think that in other parts of the system where there may be vulnerabilities of investors or transnational corporations, those food safety concerns can really be a motivating factor and can be used. And so part of the idea behind this research is to start making connections so that the people working on animal welfare in other parts of the world where food is being raised for export to China can understand the dynamics that are driving the demand in the first place, and so that there can be that kind of transnational cooperation and coordination among groups that are fighting for more sustainable and humane production and consumption systems that are, you know, as sophisticated as the types of transnational networks that are driving this system. So I hope that's a partial answer to your question. The next question, and we I think only have time for one or two because it's 10:58, is can you speak more about the controversy over use of GMOs in China? Is this an environmental concern or a trade concern? And I would just quickly use my prerogative as to say that particularly in the issue, there is an issue around corn imports where in the fall of 2013, several large shipments, hundreds of thousands of tons of U.S. corn, were turned back by China because they were a genetically engineered variety that China had not approved. So that's the issue of GMOs in China as a whole is a very big one. That one specifically ties into this question about feed and Chinese policy and is it shifting. And one of the immediate responses was that this reflected a very strong Chinese government kind of biosafety concern about GMOs. But I think another way to look at it is in the context of what Shefali has been talking about, the fact that Chinese corn imports have been increasing very rapidly and that this has put a lot of pressure on China's food self-sufficiency policies. And in fact, just in the past few days, China has released new directives that have loosened those self-sufficiency policies further. And I think the rejection of some of these varieties in 2013 was sort of trying to buy time for China's domestic industry and seed research to sort of catch up and gear up before what may be a large increase in corn imports as China's food self-sufficiency policies are further relaxed going forward. So I think that the signals in the past few days, to me, indicate that there may be a much broader increase in imports, and that eventually that may include GE crops. We're right at 11 o'clock, so I know that many of you need to leave and sign off, and you're certainly free to do so. I do want to hand it over to the speakers in case you have any final remarks. First, Emily.
Well, I just want to say thanks again for inviting me to be part of this webinar. This has been great. I've really enjoyed the conversation and all of the really excellent questions. I would just say, I guess in closing, that I think that the reports that IATP has produced about this issue are incredibly comprehensive and really important, and raise a lot of really crucial issues in terms of sort of the future of our food system. And I think that this is an important trend that we all need to be keeping our eye on. And I would just say, I guess in response to the question about GMOs in China, I think that from a Brazilian perspective, they have a similar kind of procedure for approving GM products sort of on a case-by-case basis. And I know that when China has turned back shipments of soy from Brazil for being contaminated with pesticides or that kind of thing, the Brazilians really see it as kind of a trade move for China showing its muscle. And Brazil is really, really concerned about being so dependent on China as its main export market. So there's a lot of anxiety, I think, on both sides of the table about the sovereignty implications of this very highly concentrated food market. So I will just leave it at that and hand it over to you, Shefali.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to really thank you for participating, and to everyone who was here. There was a number of questions that I think we won't get to, but I think what it really points to is the importance of really understanding more about what is really happening. And in our research, I mean, what I found in the 7 months that we took to produce 4 of these reports, apart from the challenge that China is, which is a very complex country, was how quickly things are changing. And our series is called the Global Meat Complex, which is very much what it is. It's not just China. It's not just what's happening in China and the government incentivizing this amount of production. It's also the interplay of transnational companies. In the feed issue, it's the issue around ADM, Bunge, and Cargill, but also the interplay of emerging feed companies from China going out. But in other sectors like dairy, where you have Fonterra, you have Nestle, and in the poultry sector where you have Tyson, I mean, there are a lot of things happening right now, and it's fluid. And I think this deal with Shanghai, which is now being called the WH Group, kind of shows that it's not just about the production and consumption in China, but it's about a whole model and a whole import and export system. And fundamentally, what does this mean about all these projections that we're talking about in terms of feeding the world's population, in 2050? And so what are the trade-offs? What are the costs and benefits? And I think that's what's been so rewarding. Of course, it's just the beginning. I think these 4 reports help us understand much more what is really happening in China, but also what are the entry points and exits of the global meat industry, and how do we track that, and how do we start to understand better the power that these companies have. And I think that for us, this is a very exciting time, and the reports are a beginning of this process of looking at other parts of the world and the link with the United States. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Shefali. I think that your point about China being sort of a moving target is a really important one, and the degree to which I know you've needed to sort of update the research with new information almost weekly, even during the writing process, is a reflection of the fact that going forward, you know, groups and individuals that are concerned about these issues really need to be able to have a means for staying in touch with each other, sharing information, and staying up to date, because it is a really rapidly shifting terrain, and it with a huge impact on efforts people are making, whether for animal welfare, for healthier diets, on climate change, and for rural livelihoods here in the United States, in Brazil, in China, and around the world. So I would encourage everyone, if you're interested, to tune in for the remaining webinars. I look forward to the IATP reports that are coming out. Certainly follow Professor Piney's work as it goes forward, and thank you all for attending the webinar today. Bye-bye.